Hello, everybody. Welcome to season 3 of Hashing Out the Law. I'm your host, Arash Hashemi. I'm very excited. This season is going to be a great season. My first guest is Professor Michael Polelle. He doesn't want you to call him Professor, so we're going to call him Michael. I invited him on because he is a constitutional law expert, and I wanted him to come on and talk about a specific part of the Constitution, and that is the exchange of powers, meaning when a new president is taking over from another president. And he graciously accepted to come in and talk about this. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good, Arash. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on. Um, you're also an author. We'll talk about your books. Your books are actually kind of related to this area. Um, but let's talk about what's in the news and what is coming up. Today is Monday, January 11th. We're going to have a new president being sworn in. Um, and most people don't really understand how that process is or what framework that process is set up in. Could you tell the listeners and the viewers a little bit about how that works?
The selection of a president, Arash?
Well, not just the selection of the president. I'm more interested in after when the election has been over, the votes have been counted,
Oh,
the electoral votes have been counted, and
right.
then the transition of power. So let's concentrate a little bit about the transition of power.
Okay. Well, normally the transition of power is worked out ahead of time. There's a special department to conduct the transition of power. Now, as anybody who's watched the news knows, this is not an unusual year. That the Trump administration, at least according to the incoming Biden administration, has delayed providing information. And frankly, there is no absolute timetable for this. There is governmental funding for the transition, but as so much of our constitutional law is, it depends a lot on unwritten norms and traditions. And as we've seen this year, a lot of those traditions that are not firmly written down are being challenged.
Now, the Constitution itself, I know the articles of the Constitution don't necessarily have let me rephrase my question. Where in the Constitution or within the framework of our governments is the transition of power specifically laid out?
Actually, it's not specifically laid out in the Constitution. It provides for the oath of office being taken on January 20th, but it doesn't provide for any details of the transition
So,
in terms of when certain things must be accomplished by certain dates.
so how did we come about having this transitional, um, looking for the right word, this transitional movement or this transitional function that we have today? How do we come about having that process?
By custom and usage.
Okay.
Now, in modern presidencies, as I've said, there is legislation providing for funding so that the lower level officials could get together. As I understand it, the Biden administration has been conferring with computer experts in various agencies so there could be a firm transition of information. But as you probably know from just the news, there's still complaints by incoming President-elect Biden that he hasn't gotten all the cooperation he would like with the Defense Department.
Right.
And then there's nothing, that's a matter of custom usage, the relationship between the outgoing president and the incoming president.
Right. Well, when our country was new and George Washington was in his second term, he decided not to run for a third term because he didn't want to be a dictator or a king or absolute power. Um,
Exactly.
so as a matter of tradition, everybody that came after him only ran for 2 terms, and they didn't run for a third term to hold up that tradition that Washington had started. Now, this went on until um, World War II, when we had Roosevelt, who ran for 4 terms, and right in the beginning of his 4th term, he passed away, And I know you know all this. I'm just saying this for the listeners and the viewers. And at that point, there was legislation that came about limiting the term someone can run for president to two. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's a very good example, Arash. In fact, there's another example in the news. You know, there's talk about impeaching outgoing President Trump in the few remaining days of his administration. Now, interestingly enough, I had to refresh my memory. And I thought, well, what's the precedent? Can that be done? What happens if he leaves office and they impeach him, but the Senate hasn't convicted him? Can they go after him after he leaves office? Well, it turns out that there are three views, and they're all views of law professors. There is no firm precedent. One view says everything has to be completed before he leaves. The impeachment and the conviction of impeachment, which is virtually impossible in the case of Trump.
Right.
The other says, as long as you start the impeachment, you can go on later after the president leaves office and convict him through the Senate. The third view, the most maximal view, says, even if you haven't started the impeachment, you can start it after the president leaves office, and then the Senate can convict him. Now, I'm very skeptical, because could we really go after, say, ex-President Clinton with a second impeachment? I find that incredible. But I'm saying this because although a law professor and with an emphasis in constitutional law, was surprised that there's only one precedent I could find, and that is in 1867, a lower level official in the federal government, not the president, got word that the Congress is going to impeach him for corrupt contracts. So he runs over to the president real quick, hands in his resignation. Okay, he figures he's free. Congress said, oh no, we're going ahead. So they go ahead, they impeach him. He's tried by the Senate when he's already resigned. The Senate fails to get 2/3 votes. Okay, that's the only precedent. And it's not a Supreme Court case. It's not a court case. It's a very meager precedent. But that, I think, what a lot of people don't realize, I think, who have not studied law, is the assumption that the Constitution answers all questions. And it really doesn't. There are basic questions that are left unanswered. The framers were providing simply a framework and not a detailed legislation. In fact, I would say of all the constitutions in the world, ours is probably one of the shortest. If you look at any European constitution, it's much longer, much more detailed, and it's amended more frequently.
And some scholars, I think a majority of scholars agree that that was done on purpose, so it could be interpreted by the courts as needed per the situation of the day. Is that a view that you agree with?
I'm not completely convinced. This notion we have that the courts will review every question in the Constitution, we call judicial review, was not universally agreed to at the time the Constitution was adopted. After Marbury versus Madison and the history of the Supreme Court did exercise jurisdiction over most of the Constitution. But for example, the impeachment is a good example of where the framers seem to leave out the courts. It says the sole trial for impeachment shall be in the Senate. Does that exclude the Supreme Court from reviewing what the Senate does? So far, that's been the thinking. And there are many times the Supreme Court has refused to intervene for what they call the political question, that this is a dispute between Congress and the executive department, and we choose not to involve ourselves. So there are situations where the court will not intervene. For example, also counting votes, as we've just seen recently, when Congress certifies the results of the election. The assumption has always been that Congress is the ultimate determiner of what the count is, and that there's no appeal to the Supreme Court.
Right. I do have a question for you. I want your legal opinion. So today, the House started an impeachment process.
Right.
Let's say they do finish before President Trump's term is over, and it goes to the Senate. Obviously, we said that it's never going to get done before he's out of office. And then let's say it continues while he's out of office, and the Senate tries him, gets the 2/3 vote, finds him guilty. Do
Right.
you think that he can appeal to the court system, meaning the Supreme Court? And if he can, do you think the Supreme Court will hear the case?
I personally don't think so. One reason is that the Chief Justice will sit in the impeachment in the Senate. He will preside, as you know, Chief Justice Rehnquist did, I think, in the first impeachment of Donald Trump.
Right.
And it would be unseemly for the Supreme Court to review a decision in which its own Chief Justice is sitting. And I think it's pretty well universal agreement that this is solely left up to the Senate for the decision. Very similar to counting the votes from the states and certifying the results of an election.
Right. So let me ask you another hypothetical. By the way, my Civ Pro professor in law school used to say, there is no F's. If my mom had four wheels, she would be a Cadillac. When people ask F questions. But yeah. For the amusement of our audience, I'm going to ask you this. So let's say the House, which started the impeachment process, finishes it, and it's going to go to the Senate. But he's going to be out of office. At that point, before it reaches the Senate, will he have any course of appeal or any course of fighting it?
I don't see any way he can appeal an impeachment. It's never happened. And there's nothing in the Constitution that would allow the courts to review an impeachment by Congress.
Yeah, these are unprecedented times, and it's going to be very interesting what happens. But let's talk about something else. Let's talk about, since we were talking about ifs and fiction, let's talk about a couple of your books that you've written. You written one book. The first book was called the Mithras Conspiracy, correct?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that book, please.
Well, that book is my first book as a novelist. I'm kind of in the tradition of John Grisham and Scott Turow, transitioning from law. I'm now an emeritus professor, becoming really a full-time novelist. And that's because of Scott Turow. He was a speaker at one of my media conferences, which I ran at John Marshall Law School in Chicago. And he inspired me really to say, okay, it's time to hang up the legal shingle and become a novelist, which I've always wanted to do. And I was always been intrigued with history. And I came across the cult of Mithras in many trips to Italy for professional and personal reasons, where churches were built over these ancient temples. As I looked into it, I found out there were 2,000 of these temples that are just being excavated. And they were often constructed under churches. And I think, why are they built? Why are these churches built over these pagan temples? So I got very interested in the topic. And then Dan Brown's book came out a year earlier, The Da Vinci Code, and that really inspired me. I know there's been a lot of controversy about whether you like his style or not, but the whole idea that history contains mysteries, not fabrications, actual mysteries based on historical facts. And the intrigue is that we don't know all the facts, and that's where the novelist comes in. So that's how I got started with the Mithras Conspiracy and the interesting cult of Mithras.
Right. And you speak fluent Italian, so for you.
Poco parlare, sì. Yeah, I do, and I really got to the point when I was in Italy for a while where I felt comfortable. But if you don't, as you know, if you don't practice a language continually, you get a little rusty.
Right. So my point was, for you, it was not only a novel, but sort of like a research project, and you got to practice your Italian as well.
Yeah, it was really the setting inspired me in the novel of Da Vinci Code coming out. And I've always been a student of history, interested in history. I had, studied Latin, was familiar with classical history. But it also helped me work out some issues I've had. I think Dan Brown hit something when he started dealing with religion. Now, religion's a hot topic, just as politics is.
Right.
And I guess we're growing up in a family, both topics were freely discussed. So what always intrigued me is if you go to my website, you'll see there's a statement by a emeritus professor of archaeology and classical studies at University of Minnesota, where he said a great deal of good and a great deal of evil has been brought into the world through religions. And what I saw, and what intrigued me is for about 100 years, Mithraism and Christianity existed side by side, just like our Protestant church or Catholic church, perhaps our mosques exist. And I was intrigued. How did these people relate to each other? Now, I know the end was not a happy ending. Paganism was outlawed. Some of the old statues were defaced, much as the Taliban defaced the Buddha statue. Christian symbols were carved into these ancient statues. Even though there were similarities between Mithraism and Christianity in terms of doing good, fighting evil. And it raised that question that actually Charles Darwin raised in his book. He said, looking at biology and the way we classify animals, and I guess you could say people if we want to go to anthropology, there are what he called the splitters, who always want to show the differences between things, and there are the unifiers who want to show similarities. And it seemed to me that what would happen is that you had people who were very afraid of this competing religion. In fact, some of the early Christians thought it must have been the devil who created Mithraism, because some of the doctrines were very close to Christianity in terms of doing good, the 7 stages of perfection. Others lived peacefully with them. In fact, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a book, not a book, actually a research paper, not well known, in which he himself was fascinated with the similarities between Mithraism and Christianity, and concluded that there were these similarities, but it was not something to be afraid of, that there are certain religious concepts that are universal, and perhaps the better part of religions that are shared by them all. But the other part of me as the writer knew that I wasn't writing a history book. So I tied it into a modern situation where there's a crisis in Italy with the government, and a neo-fascist cult uses the myth of Mithras and distorts it to justify an attack on the Italian government and on the Catholic hierarchy in the city. And so it involves acts of terrorism and a final confrontation in a Mithraeum, or a chapel to Mithras, which is actually located under the Baths of Caracalla in Rome. So it's a modern novel in the sense that it involves a detective, but it relates to the past and how the past still lives with us today and can influence current events.
That's great. You mentioned your website. What is your website? We're going to include it for all the listeners and the viewers. Okay. Please tell us what it is.
The website is MJP, as in Peter, OLELLE, MJ Polelle, my initial of my first name, my middle name, and my last name, .com, MJPOLELLE.com. By the way, Arash, you might want to know you're out in California, is that correct?
I am in California, yes.
Well, I spent a week in Rome doing research with an Italian archaeologist, studying the chapels. The Mithraist cult, they built their chapels underground, typically. And J. Paul Getty recreated the Villa of the Papyri, which is part of my book. That's where the mystery is, where 2 ancient scrolls are discovered, creating conflict in the novel. And so I spent about 3 beautiful days, I think near Malibu, with the J. Paul Getty.
The Getty Villa, yeah.
Yeah, because the Villa of the Papyri is a prominent part of my novel, The Mithras Conspiracy.
Oh, that's very interesting. The Getty Villa is actually very beautiful.
It is a lovely place.
It is very lovely. Now, your book, people can get on your website, correct?
Correct. If you go to my website, you'll see there's a a link to Amazon, and and also Amazon, I think Barnes and Noble, and you can order the book from my website. One other thing I want to add, excuse me, Arash, one thing I want to add, even if you don't want to buy the book, you look at my website, there are free historical notes that I offer to you. Now, there's a price, of course. You have to give me your email, which I promise never to use for anything other than communicating what I'm doing as a writer. But these notes fall into two parts. One, the history of what we know of the cult of Mithras, and secondly, Italian politics and how conspiracies have always been part of Italian politics, so that what I propose in the novel is not completely far-fetched.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. I was going to say we're going to include the links to Amazon and Barnes and Noble in the description of the podcast on this episode, so the viewers can actually click on it and purchase your book. What I'm excited to talk about even more is your new book that's coming out called The American Conspiracy. And we talked about this off camera a little bit. It's a coincidence, but it's actually fitting for the events of what's happening in our country. Tell us about your new book, The American Conspiracy.
It is really strange. For the Mithras Conspiracy, I originally had a pope who resigned, thinking, well, that's great. No pope has ever resigned since the Middle Ages. In the middle of writing my novel, Pope Benedict resigns. So I had to put the Pope in a coma instead. As far as I know, no Pope has ever been in a coma. Well, this book is even more strange because I started writing this book before the current election. It was a couple of years ago. And part of this came from my experience as a law professor. I realized that there were a lot of potential issues with presidential elections, including what happens if an election's thrown into the House of Representatives. And so I started exploring all the things that might go wrong with an American election. Little did I know that some of these problems would be occurring already. I was fortunate that at least this election was not thrown into the House of Representatives, as in my novel, which creates additional problems for deciding who the successor is. But that was a very strange situation. I also, in my novel, The American Conspiracy, had a vice president who becomes a backdoor president through the House of Representatives, through Congress, and then is trying to be ousted by a coup orchestrated by an aging tycoon with the assistance of a retired military general. And this vice president, it turns out that she is an African-American woman, long before Kamala Harris was the vice presidential candidate. So I'm in a hurry to get this book out before anything else happens.
When is the book coming out?
Well, I'm going to be having the manuscript edited in the next week. And so it will come out this year, probably within 6 months by the time everything is done and it's uploaded to Amazon and on my website and edited.
I'm excited to read about it. I am afraid about your third book. I don't know what you're thinking of writing, but
I'm a little concerned because as I was writing the first book, I had the idea for the second book, and I have to feel personally as a writer, I have to feel emotionally strong about the issue. Otherwise, it's just too arduous to write a book. Believe me. But if you have, for me, I need the commitment to do it. And right now, I don't know what I would write about, so I'm just letting that hang for a while. What does interest me, though, is I live in Florida where we have a closed primary, which means I, as an independent voter, cannot vote in a primary, even though my tax money is being used by the state to fund primaries. I'm thinking of a book and maybe even a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of this, because I think keeping out independent voters is one of the reasons we have this polarization. We have candidates who are elected by the hardcore wings of their respective parties. And I don't think we're getting the full spectrum of American voters.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's a whole different topic.
Right.
So let me ask you this. I know you are a fan of history, you're a student of history, and you were inspired to be a novelist. If you had to start all over again, would you be a novelist right off the bat, or would
No,
you? No.
no. There's some things in life you always say, what if I had taken another road? That was one I was very clear in my mind that I did not want to be a starving artist. I knew even then how difficult it might be to be a novelist. And in reality, it wasn't just that. I really enjoyed the law. I enjoyed what you might call left brain activities of logic, argumentation. I was a debater. So I enjoyed being a lawyer. I was a civil trial lawyer for about 5 years, although most of my career was in teaching. But I always felt, even as a young man, that I was not the kind of person that could just do one thing or one activity or occupation for the rest of his life. Some people it works, some people it doesn't. And it was very fortunate for me because about the time I was thinking of leaving teaching, I found this new passion in my life. And so that the transition became a lot easier than it might have been.
That's great. That's great. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your books and the constitutional questions we had, or I had, about the transition of power. I don't want to take up a lot of your time. I know you're a very busy man. Um, Michael Polelle is my guest for all the listeners and the viewers. His website is mjpolelle.com. You can actually purchase his books there. You can actually get free author notes, which include his research on his first book and about Italian government and conspiracy in the Italian government. Michael, anything else you want the listeners and the viewers to know?
Only that I'm very happy to talk with another fellow lawyer because often I don't have a chance to talk to other people who have legal training about certain issues that interest me. And I appreciate your giving me the opportunity to speak today, Arash.
It was a pleasure having you on. When your new book does come out, I would love to have you back on so we can discuss your new book.
I'd be happy to do so.
It was a great pleasure having you on, and I wish you the luck.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.